Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to you all. So right now, it looks like we have about 65 participants or so. We're expecting more, but they probably are just hoping to miss this introduction on my part and come in for Professor Duvall. I have a couple of remarks to make first, though. So my name is Lucas Rickert. I'm the George Erdung Chair in the History of Pharmacy here at UW-Madison. I'm also the Historical Director of the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy. If you would like to learn more about either, you can visit the Twitter accounts and Facebook pages and AIHP.org, so very easily searchable. You can follow along in this way if you so desire. We're really lucky today. We've got Professor Chris Duvall with us, and he's here to talk about his recent book called The African Roots of Marijuana, which was published by Duke University Press. But before he takes the virtual floor, I just wanted to make a couple of quick remarks about the seminar series. So, as you know, the seminar series, or the Kreminar as we're calling them, is named after Edward Kremers. He lived from 1864 to 1941. He was the second director of the UW Department of Pharmacy, and he was also a co-founder of the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy. We named the series after him because he very much believed in the value of history and the value of humanistic research in pharmacy and the health sciences more broadly. We also named the series after him because he encouraged critical thought about drug consumption and control in the United States and in the wider world. In particular, he encouraged the news media, politicians, and pharmacy leaders to think very critically about the meanings and assumptions associated with words like drug, narcotics, and medicine. We're still struggling with this today. The year 2020, of course, represents the 50th anniversary of the Controlled Substances Act here in the US, which placed cannabis in Schedule 1, and that's the category reserved for substances with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Kremers also believed that language matters tremendously, and he worried about demonizing certain groups in the United States. He opposed prohibitionist impulses and prohibitionist organizations, arguing stridently that restrictive measures would not solve the misuse of certain substances. And finally, Kremers, and I think this is crucial in light of politics in 2020, resisted language and policies that placed blame on marginalized groups or foreigners for crime and addiction. So the understanding of intoxicants, drugs, pharmaceuticals, and addiction obviously have direct impact on health and on policy. You can't think about pharmacy and drugs without thinking about race and class and gender. The scheduling of a substance and its acceptance as a medicine or not impacts law enforcement, and it impacts race in society. It impacts how certain groups may be targeted and may be terrorized, and it impacts social justice and equity. Now, for pharmacists in particular, the scheduling of a substance like cannabis places them in a bind where they may be obeying state law, but disobeying federal law. So all that said, the Kreminars are designed to get us thinking more broadly about drugs, narcotics, and pharmacy. And I think we're really lucky today to have Professor Chris Duvall with us. The structure for today's talk is straightforward. He's going to give a presentation, and then we're going to have a conversation and questions from everyone who are involved. The Q&A box is open, and you can submit your questions and they are going to be noted, jotted down, and interpreted by Dr. Naomi Rendina, who's here, and welcome to you as well, Dr. Rendina. Congratulations as well. She just defended her dissertation, Pharmaceuticals and the Nature of American Childbirth. Dr. Rendina, really happy to have you involved with the Institute. She's been the recipient of awards from the American Association of the History of Medicine, the Organization of American Historians, and AIHP. Her career is just getting started, and it's wonderful to have you as not only the moderator here today, but also the AIHP's social media coordinator. So thanks for doing this today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our speaker today is Professor Chris Duvall. He's professor of Geography and Environmental Studies, and also the department chair at the University of New Mexico. Professor Duvall, as a biogeographer, his research relates to how humans represent and depict their environment, as well as human-plant interaction. So his academic interests include cultural and historical ecology, African diaspora, food geography, and science studies. I suppose specifically, Duvall is interested in how the social constructions of human difference affect access to the use of environmental resources, human-environment interactions involved in illicit drug commerce, and then the environmental meanings of food. So there's a lot there. He's with us today to talk about his research that's focused on cannabis and other plants in Western Central Africa, which have been used medicinally. He's the author of Cannabis, which was published by Reaktion Books in 2015, and he's the author of The American Roots of Cannabis, Duke University Press, in 2019. This most recent book has been called Timely and Compelling in the way that it engages with contemporary interest in medical marijuana and the revision underway in the racial stereotyping of drug users. Another commentator has called the book very important because while cannabis has been written about many times, few works actually explore the crucial importance of Africa and Africans in the story. And I'll end the introduction there. Thank you very much, Professor Duvall, for being with us today.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. And I hope everyone is doing well in the diverse parts of the world where we are located. Could you tell me if I change the view on my computer, does that change how you guys are seeing the PowerPoint slides? Do you see any change?
No change.
Okay,
No change.
okay. If I use the arrow like this, are you guys able to see that?
No. If you want, though, you can annotate on it.
No, I just wanted to know how my screen is actually appearing to you guys. All right. Okay, so the African roots of marijuana, that's a huge topic. This is, as Luke mentioned, this is a book. There we go. Which came out last year. And unlike a lot of histories that we'll hear in this series, this is a really broad scale thing. It doesn't focus on a specific area, and is pretty broad in terms of time scale as well. So, you know, the documents that I work with are mostly 19th century, but I'm trying to think about things that go back well before that. Also, in terms of the table of contents that you can see there, I'll be touching on material from about 5 of those chapters. And so there's a lot that I can't get to today. But if you have questions about any aspect of it, just go ahead and ask. Kind of the general context that I'm working in is, the huge literature on cannabis, but really looking at stuff that circulates pretty widely. And so books like The Emperor Wears No Clothes in the upper left. If you're a scholar and you read this, it's kind of a joke. It's advocacy sort of material, but it's much more widely read than any academic work out there. And so I try to address ideas that are out in popular media, because those ideas in popular media trickle down into scholarly literature. And so there's books like the one in the upper right came out a couple of years ago, and it's a huge book. It's basically a global history of the plant and its uses and things like that. But a lot of that of the book is based on kind of this common knowledge that isn't tested and isn't analyzed in much detail at all. And you also see these kind of popular ideas really at the root of a lot of the medical literature as well. And so I try to address ideas in all of these different literatures. I'll talk about my sources a little bit as we go forward, but most everything that I work with is published literature. The literature that exists on cannabis is pretty rich for Africa, especially for the 19th century. And most all of the works that I mention through this talk really haven't been cited in recent literature, even though they provide us very good ideas of what was going on historically with cannabis in Africa. Luke mentioned I'm a biogeographer, and basically what that means is I look at the distribution of plants and animals and try to understand how people have impacted them and how the distributions also affect human understandings of the plants and animals themselves. And so in terms of theory, what I do in my history, a lot of it is based on botanical taxonomy, right? And if we look at the formal taxonomy of cannabis, it traces back, again, this is the formal official botanical taxonomy, goes back to this paper from 1976 by two botanists. And this is the dominant way of thinking about cannabis, is that it's one single species, right, that has two different uses. And the way that this is understood in many cases by botanists is that these two different subspecies, is what they're labeled, are products of human behavior, right? So you had in the weakly intoxicant half of this diagram here, you had a group of people choose fiber and oil, and over time they developed that subspecies, whereas you had other people choose narcotic uses, and over time their agricultural selection produced this other subspecies, right? And it's important to understand what this kind of taxonomy of the plant does and what it enables in terms of history, right? Basically, what it enables is a very Eurocentric understanding and framing of the plant's past, right? And so if it's one species where you have two different groups of users, basically, that are producing these different characteristics, you can easily, and what has happened is that race has been mapped onto this very prominently in the cannabis literature, right? And so the map that you see here is from a widely used source by cannabis studies folks. And it presents a very Eurocentric pattern of diffusion, of dispersal of this plant across the Atlantic. You see all of the arrows going from Europe into the Americas, Africa, and this framing is really only important because it's a good place to put a label for other information on the map. But if you look at how this pattern, this geographic pattern has been framed, this quote in the bottom is a classic example here, right? It's the idea that there is one type of cannabis, and if people decide to use it in one way, then it has certain effects, and in particular, race and people of color, blacks in the United States and the Americas more generally, have been framed as knowing something special about marijuana simply because of their race, right? And there is a broad awareness that it has an African history, as you can see in the last sentence of that quote there. but there's no exploration about it at all. There's no information about it. It's just kind of, thrown out there. And so if we look at cannabis in a different way, right, instead of one species with two different uses, but instead we look at it as two different genetic groups, right? You could call these species, but two different genetic groups, we can see that there's two different histories that we have to look at here. And this, genetic grouping isn't just, a theory. There's been a lot of research on cannabis genetics in the past 15 or 20 years, and it's very consistent that there are these two major genetic groups. One has the genetic machinery to produce, THC and the, other cannabinoids that contribute to psychoactive effects, whereas the other group doesn't have that genetic machinery, right? And generally speaking, these genetic groups are called indica and sativa, which is the term that's used on this map here. Those two terms, indica and sativa, are confusing if you know anything about cannabis and how it's discussed, and I can talk about the meanings of it, but I'll try to just stick to those two particular meanings of these genetic groups. Of course, these terms are used in modern marijuana commerce, and they mean something different there, and so I'll bring that up briefly. But, this is a very, very generalized summary type map, but each of those arrows, there's a different historical record of, and so you can look at and think about different groups of people with different groups of plants and plant material traveling and doing different things to produce this global pattern. So I really am focused on Western Central Africa. You can see on the left hand or west coast of Africa, you can see a group of arrows kind of emanating from what's now Angola. That's really what a lot of my work is focused on. I'll talk about that specifically, mostly today. But I'm really, again, this is a broad scale sort of thing, and I've looked at Africa more broadly. And so I'll mention South Africa probably second most here, but also I can answer questions about North Africa if you're interested. I won't talk much more about that. So Africa is important in cannabis history. It's been a subsistence drug crop. In the eastern, the three regions that are mentioned here, East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa, there's evidence that goes back about 2,000 years as the earliest in Madagascar in particular, in terms of where it, the early evidence for it in Africa is located. The earliest images is this one and the one I'll show you on the next slide. People used it in a whole diversity of ways I'll talk about briefly in a moment. But there's a lot of knowledge there is the short answer. It's important to realize that, that prior image was Angola. This image is Mozambique from the 1790s. The man on the right is holding a water pipe. I'll go back one slide. The guy on the second from the right is also holding a water pipe. It's not as clear there. His is made out of a calabash in this next slide, this image. This is made out of a horn. The water pipe is an African invention. We have archaeological evidence that goes back, again, about 2,000 years. It appears to have been invented before cannabis showed up in most landscapes. But all of the water pipes that people use nowadays ultimately trace back to these African technologies. And so if, we look at language, right, and so this is a map of, each dot represents a different language. These terms for cannabis are from published dictionaries and other sources of language information. We see several major groupings of language terms, and basically what the colored words here are representing are roots of words. Each of these roots have a different sort of set of, very broad cultural practices associated with them, kind of broad cultural histories associated with them. There's a lot of variation and diversity in how the individual words are spelled. And so on the left, there's a handful of examples, from Mozambique. The pronunciation of the first two is roughly the same. They're spelled differently because of different writing orthography in Portuguese versus French versus English. But we see a similar pattern of word forms that are extended across the continent. Kimbundu, the Kimbundu tomb, I pulled that aside because it's important in how people have looked at African cannabis history, but African cannabis history in particular in the Atlantic, and I'll come back to that. It's important to understand, though, that the words, the Sena, Avia, Wolof words, and the first Kimbundu word, that's named for the plant itself. And in many languages, especially in Western Central Africa, to talk about material that you'll smoke, you ask for some cannabis or some tobacco, and you do that by affixing a plural prefix. And so in the Kimbundu term, the plural is Mariamba, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But it's also important to recognize the black dots on this map. These are other terms that aren't obviously related to the main ones that I've represented. And so there's a lot of diversity of histories that the different cultures in Africa have with the plant, and it's I'm only talking very generalized terms about cannabis in general, in Africa. So if we look at that, the pattern of terms, and we look at that alongside historical accounts, we can see a number of different kind of human vectors that carried the plant in different directions at different times. One thing that if you kind of just glance at this map, there's a couple of key factors. One is trade, right? The plant, and you see that from East Africa all the way to Western Africa, the plant was a trade item. People exchanged it for other plants. They exchanged it for cash or cash substitutes. It was valued in markets, and so it traveled in markets. The other thing that pops up fairly obviously is slavery, right? And this is a plant that traveled in the slave trade, and it was used within the slave trade for specific reasons, pharmaceutical reasons that I'll talk about in a moment, right? But again, each of these arrows is a different set of stories and a different set of documentation that I can answer some questions about. Now, slavery, this is a very well-documented use of the plant. So documentation and sources, just to comment on that briefly, the challenge is that Europeans didn't care a whole lot about cannabis in Africa at all until about the 1790s, a little earlier than that in South Africa. So we have the literature in South Africa that goes back to the late 1600s, but it isn't really that substantial until the later 1700s. Elsewhere, Europeans they didn't really care what Africans were smoking. They just thought it was smelled bad, and they didn't give us a whole lot of information about it. Starting in the 1820s, really, 1830s, 1840s, as Europeans kind of gained an understanding of cannabis as a potentially useful, from their perspective, potentially useful in pharmaceutical applications, then they started writing about it more. And of course, that period of 1820s, 30s, 40s, and so on is after the end of the formal slave trade across the Atlantic. And so the documentary record begins just as slavery is ending, but there's a very consistent pattern of evidence. And so I think it's reasonable to kind of backdate some of the relationships that we see very well documented to, somewhat earlier in the period of slavery. But, again, each portion of the continent, there's a different timeline that we have to pay attention to. In Western Central Africa, cannabis appeared to start arriving there in the mid to late 1700s. It was first documented about 1800 in association with slave trading. And, this document, which was published in a European pharmaceutical journal, but it hasn't been cited in more recent works, clearly describes how slave traders would give cannabis to the slaves, the people that they held captive, as a way to kind of get them motivated and get them moving. And, when I tell people about this, they think of, I don't know, Cheech and Chong or Pineapple Express or something that it just, if you get high, you eat Cheetos and don't do anything. Well, historically, what the plant was used for is kind of a stimulant prior to labor, during labor, and kind of as a relaxant after labor. And to use the terms that are current in current marijuana markets, dispensaries, this is the sativa set of strains is generally what these are described as, and so sort of a pseudo-stimulant. But there's lots of accounts of porters in Western Africa in particular getting up in the morning. And these were guys whose job was to carry 50 to 80 pounds on their heads for marches of 10 to 30 miles per day for weeks on end. They weren't given tents or shelters or anything like that. They had very difficult jobs. And so there's a lot of descriptions of these guys getting up in the morning and smoking to get going, of them smoking at breaks they have during the day, and then also at the end of the day smoking just kind of as a social stimulant, right? And so this is kind of one of the vectors that really brought cannabis widely across the continent. If we look at a broader scale, if we look at the Atlantic more broadly, just looking at those three sets of terms that are indicated here with circles, these are the African terms. You saw these on earlier maps. We see that these exist on the other side of the Atlantic as well, right? And so this pattern of using the plural that you see just to the left, the west of Africa on this map of Mariamba, we see that pattern of using the plural in a number of different contexts in the Americas. So in Brazil, you can see different forms of it. Maruamba is what has been published there. We also see up in Colombia, and this is something Dr. Brito mentioned this term last week as marimba, which is also has been reported and recorded in Cuba. These are both areas that there was a lot of slaves, a lot of enslaved people from Western and Central Africa ended up in those locations. We see other terms that are less familiar showing up in different parts of the Americas, but the one that we all know, marijuana, is part of this ocean-wide pattern of these sets of terms being used in very specific kind of grammatical and lexicography, in terms of the word structure of context. So we see a lot of African evidence of African knowledge just in the terminology. If we look at the documentary record, again, these are all published documents, but they're very clear in providing us information about what slaves were doing with this plant in particular. And so on the bottom right, this was a French-American traveler. This is the only description that we have of any plant held by a slave in Africa, and it was cannabis, right? Liamba is the term that you used there. We have good evidence from West Africa, so Sierra Leone is the quote in the upper right. Same with Liberia. The context for that quote is towards the end of the slave trade, the British Navy were capturing slave ships and resettling the enslaved people, the captive people in Sierra Leone in particular, but also other parts of the Atlantic, including Jamaica and the Americas. Right, and so these folks were really well documented by the British, and they were just a very small segment of the total population that was shipped across the Atlantic during that period. So we can infer that, the places where people ended up from Western Central Africa, there was similar processes and patterns of plant use that were going on. And indeed, the quote on the left is an oral history. It was collected sometime in the first decade of the 20th century. There's actual accounts of how people carried these seeds, and there's accounts of other plants where people were carrying seeds in their hair and in the rags that they were given to wear. And so this is a solid explanation of how they were able to carry these things, the seeds, right? So the challenge, though, is that Europeans saw this, the smoking, the drug use, as being, on one hand, what got their laborers going, but on the other hand, they were very judgmental against the unfamiliar practice, right? And so the quote in the upper left is by a traveler, Mary Kingsley. She's talking about Gabon here. And so she recognizes that this is good. This gets the porters up in the morning. But at the same time, she thought it was just appalling. It caused them to cough, and she just thought that was the worst thing that she had to endure when she was in Western Africa, is hearing people cough after they smoked cannabis. And so she was all about shifting over, giving the laborers alcohol rather than having them smoke cannabis. In South Africa, this, again, the top quote is from Gabon. It's kind of representative of Western Central Africa. Very same sort of attitudes and discourse elsewhere. The quote on the bottom is from South Africa. The term that's used there is a pejorative term, so it shouldn't be used in modern speech, in case you're unfamiliar with it. And this guy was, saying how lazy it made the people, but at the same time, employers paid people with cannabis, with dacha, up into the mid 20th century, right? And so we have this kind of conflict between the needs of stimulating labor, but also seeing it as something damaging because of because it was an unfamiliar practice to Europeans. But again, you can get a sense of the work, the lifestyle that these folks had. The porter on the right, he appears to have had a major wound to his stomach, but he's still working. The loads that they were carrying in Angola about that point in time, the standard was between about 60 and 80 pounds. And again, they hiked with these things for long periods of time. This was the same demographic group that dominated slavery in the end of the slavery period. The work that they did was, nominally free, but they were most of them were coerced into doing it. So very similar to kind of social relationships that existed earlier during the period of formal slavery, right? And so the other thing we have to kind of recognize is that Europeans didn't put any value in the knowledge that people displayed of using cannabis, right? And so two things here. On the right, is the reality that the water pipe remains what, the preferred kind of method of smoking cannabis worldwide, right? And there are different ways of doing it, and there's other practices that people had in ancient times to inhale cannabis smoke, but it's a very efficient technology. It is very portable, and so people were able to bring it with them, while they were traveling along with the seeds. It's easy to kind of dismiss this as just something that stoners use, but this is a very efficient technology that hasn't been improved upon. If you look at the patented bong that was patented in the U.S. in 1980, it's effectively the same thing as that we have descriptions and archaeological records of from Africa from centuries before, and the patent doesn't recognize prior art in Africa. On the left is a longer quote. This is from South Africa, and it describes how people process people in a particular location. This was in Natal, if I remember correctly, how they process the plant material into pharmaceutical agents, right? The stuff that they smoked. We have suggestions of a rich pharmaceutical or pharmacological knowledge elsewhere in Africa. The Europeans just didn't write anything about it, really. They just kind of dismissed it. they dismissed African pipes and African knowledge of cannabis as just something that the Africans were imitating from Muslims, right? And so there's a discourse of, anti-Islamic stereotypes that exist in historically in this record, and Africans are just kind of portrayed as being, hapless and helplessly influenced by Muslims from North Africa and what we call the Middle East, whereas this was very advanced knowledge that we still use, even though people don't recognize that. Okay, and so this is kind of a shift here, and since this is, this series is about the history of pharmacy, I touch on it a little bit, and basically what I want to argue in these last sets of slides is that, the crash of the historic global market in pharmaceutical cannabis, this happened in the 1920s. Partly it was because of laws and changing context of how pharmaceutical practice will be managed. Adam Rathi, I think, is here today. He'll talk later in this series, and he's written a lot more on this than I will and have and will. But in thinking about how culture and colonialism and portrayals of culture and attitudes towards colonialism kind of combine to shape the economic context that unfolded in the 1920s. That's really what I'm interested in, rather than just looking at the legal aspect, right? The legal aspect existed within an economic context, and that's what I kind of want to look at here briefly. Okay, so the neglect and the ignorance of African knowledge, this was a contributing factor to the crash of the global pharmaceutical market. And there's three factors, right? It didn't, ignorance of African knowledge, it didn't cause the crash, but it was a contributing factor. And there's three factors that I want to touch on briefly. One is limited pharmacological knowledge, and I won't say much about that. The second, though, is more important, thinking about where the material that was in the pharmaceutical market came from, right? And this was pretty much all produced in India, and so we have to think about the colonial and anti-colonial context in India to kind of understand the economics that, kind of played into the legal changes in the early 20th century. And then the last is a rejection of non-Western knowledge. And so there is where the rejection of African knowledge is relevant, but also other parts of the world as well. And so, again, I'm not going to say much at all about pharmaceutical knowledge of cannabis. This was something that, despite how it's framed in popular media nowadays, this was not a highly reliable drug. The pharmacist at the time didn't know about its action. They didn't know how to produce anything consistent out of it. And they had a lot of misunderstandings of how it could be used and what the effectiveness was of the substance. And there's lots of quotes like these two that talk about how it's just an unreliable substance. Again, part of that is pharmaceutical practice. The other part of it, though, is what was going on in India, right? So we have to understand that in India, there was kind of a single market for for ganja. That's what was sold as Indian hemp in the global pharmaceutical market. There's basically these two competing uses of it, right? People who knew a lot about it would consume it, as on the left, and then people would also purchase it to manufacture pharmaceuticals, right? And the competing uses contributed to kind of the poor quality of the material that was in the pharmaceutical markets. And basically what happened is the London wholesale market was really the center of the global commerce. Most of the material in London was coming out of Bombay. This in India was second class, like not very good ganja, right? The best ganja was coming from Calcutta. Most of the Calcutta exports were going to Guyana, right? In Guyana, there was a large population of Indian laborers. And so they were buying the better material from India And then in some cases, they were actually re-exporting it to different locations. There were some other places where, there's other connections within the market, but the key thing here is that the good stuff from Calcutta was not, generally speaking, going to the London wholesale market, because, the sellers in India were going for the people who knew the quality and were willing to pay for the quality, right? And so the colonial sellers, basically, they took advantage of ignorant British buyers. This was contrary to colonial social order, but basically they were selling last year's produce, right? They were selling stuff that was expired, that was bad, herbal material, and so when it was bought in London and processed in pharmacies, it ended up producing ineffective material. Certainly there was some material that was effective, and there's plenty of stories of people in Europe getting high off of, extracts. So there was, potent material coming through, but for the most part, or for a large part at least, people in India were selling the crap to the global pharmaceutical market and keeping the good stuff, or they would export it to these other markets where people knew what was going on, right? And so, you can see in this quote, but also in this slide, a lot of, the reading I did about this was through pharmaceutical journals in the 19th and early 20th century, and they have some really remarkable accounts of cannabis trading and whatnot during that point in time. There was this article from 1893 that talked about consumers in Guyana, and again, these were indentured Indian laborers for the most part, and it talks specifically how they knew quality and they looked for specific things in the cannabis that was imported that the pharmacists didn't know to look for, right? And, in 1925 basically is when the UK finally said, well, okay, we can prohibit cannabis. They were willing to go along with kind of international sentiment at that point in time. The pharmacists they were writing here, they said, we still don't get why it is these people are doing these things, right? They had observed, this specific practice of using, the seed, the flowers and the seed seed leaves is what they're called. They observed people doing this for decades, but they never tried to go about and understand why, right? And so, this is when it was closed, and they still had ignorance of what was, what was being done and why people were doing this. They neglected the non-Western knowledge of people who knew what they were doing. The other neglect that happened was that in Africa, there was formal markets as well. There's 5 of them that are indicated here. By a formal market, I mean something that was taxed. It was, there's records of this, in terms of government tax records and things like that. These were active markets. The ones in Morocco and Tunisia existed up until the 1950s. Angola, Mozambique, Egypt were active for several decades in the late 1800s. These were reasonably successful and profitable markets. People were making money off of them. The governments were making a little bit of tax revenue off of them, but these never participated to any significant degree, at least in the global pharmaceutical market, right? And so this slide has a lot of information on it, but basically the economic relationship that emerged because of these 3 factors, right, was that in the 1920s, in the early 1920s, what ended up happening is you had pharmaceutical cannabis become a low value pharmaceutical, right? It wasn't reliable. European physicians, Western physicians didn't really know how to use it consistently. The pharmacists didn't know how to produce consistent medicines out of it. And so it was really not very widely used because it wasn't valued in medicine. At the same time, it was a high cost item, right? And so if you look at the graph, basically the white, the round, the white circles, right, is the Bombay being sold in London. You can see at about 1900, the price for Bombay ganja started increasing. And that's because the British colonial government kept increasing taxes starting at that point in time. in order to generate revenues, but also in order to control consumption within the colony. The X's that you see on the graph, that's the New York wholesale market, and you can see that tracks the British market prices pretty closely because New York was supplied by London. And then the other thing to look at is in the period 1900 to the 1920 to the end of the graph, you see a number of symbols in the lower right. These were lower cost, right? I should have mentioned on the vertical axis, this is kind of a standardized and normalized price for these this material. You can see there was lower cost material available on markets. This was, what was existing in the Angola and Mozambique and Gabon markets. Even, the plus signs here, this is, so-called Indian hemp produced in the United States. These were considered low cost because the kind of idea that, psychoactive cannabis is an Indian thing meant that pharmaceutical buyers weren't generally willing to buy stuff that wasn't grown in India, even though the stuff they were getting from India was low quality and overpriced because of colonial taxation, right? And so if there was better understanding, for instance, of the Mozambique or Angolan markets, that this was high quality material, the pricing structure of the international market would have been much different in the last days of the legal market, right? And so, in Africa, there was, even though there was these valuable markets, there was an increasing dislike of cannabis use amongst workers, right? And so two things being shown on this slide here. One in the map is just the dates at which there was stronger or lesser controls on cannabis. In many cases, these were more or less absolute prohibitions. And you can see that these all, predate in some cases by decades. The 1925 international, the Geneva Agreement that put cannabis in the under international control regime. Then the other is the quote from the left, which is from Mozambique's 1914 law, and this was, kind of exemplified the explicitly racist terminology in many cases that were used in banning cannabis in these areas, in these colonies, right? And so you had this shift away from tolerating it amongst workers to outright, banning it amongst workers for various reasons that I can talk about. But if you go to look at the 1925 convention, you have some more familiar terms. The left red oval there, those were terms for hashish or resin that were used mostly, in what we would call the Middle East, principally is where those were used. And then the other one you have is sub-Saharan Africa, right? And the presence of this term has been neglected in looking at the rise of international prohibition. But we just have to understand that, if we look at the historical record, the world really came into compliance with African attitudes about, colonial African attitudes about cannabis, right? And so this quote was from, basically the law in French Congo, Congo Brazzaville, of, how the governor at that point in time thought that cannabis and those who sell it should be treated, right? And, I think that there's, prohibitionists from the late 20th century in the United States, for instance, that would have no problem saying the same phrasing there, right? And so to kind of, wrap up here, it's really important to understand the plant drugs past in Africa for understanding it in our current society. And so if you've spent any time looking at articles about cannabis in medical journals, many of them are pro-cannabis politically, right? And they bring up the history of cannabis simply to kind of justify interest in it in current society. They mention people like Queen Victoria, to kind of say, well, if it was such a high-class thing in the past, why can't it be a high-class thing now? And, these are misleading, false, or inaccurate. Most of the stories that are told about cannabis history in the medical literature like this, whereas the very well documented African history is absolutely absent. There's no mention whatsoever of even general terms that, you know, slavery existed and then cannabis existed within slavery. There's nothing about that in the literature. And if you look at the, you know, history of drugs literature more generally, you know, the African past is neglected and a lot of times presented in stereotypes that in some cases go back to kind of colonial period portrayals of people, right? And so this is a very important book and it's solid, but pretty much everything that's written about Africa in it is in, you know, a quarter of a page, and it focuses on Brazil, and it comes up with this idea of, you know, slaves smoked cannabis to, you know, to dream and you know, to dream while they were given time to rest. This is very much, you know, in line with how it was presented in Central Africa back in the colonial period, of these guys just laying around, you know, smoking cannabis. The reality is that is very well documented is, you know, the use by hard laborers, people like these guys that are all porters, and people dealing with very difficult conditions, not, you know, Queen Victoria, but the people that Queen Victoria ultimately profited off of, because these were hard laborers within the colonial regimes that they were part of her empire, right? And so it's important to kind of think about what, you know, race and class, you know, what, you know, how cannabis existed within structures of race and class historically, but also about how current portrayals of race and class kind of color and distort our understanding of its history. And just to, you know, bring it in the final slide here, bring it back to thinking about justifying interest in current uses of cannabis. Well, the African past very much supports thinking about looking at cannabis as a way of treating or managing at least trauma, which is something that has appeared in medical literature recently. All right, so a lot of material kind of gone through quickly, so I will close there and am happy to take questions if I can figure out how to turn my screen off.
Maybe Kristen can put up that slide. Oh, look, she's already done it. Or you've done it, Chris. Oh, brilliant.
Accidentally, though.
Thanks so much for that wonderful talk. Instead of me, you know, asking you questions right off the bat, Naomi, can I invite you to maybe engage with some of the questions from the audience, and just to let everyone know out there that we've got people listening in from different countries in South and Latin America, and from Africa. We've got people in the United States and Canada and in Europe. So thanks for listening in. And Naomi, can I turn over to you?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. So we've got some good questions. But first, so I did notice some overlap with my own research. So I'm interested in more the pharmaceutical side. But I saw maybe Dr. Duvall, you could speak more about this. So a lot of the pharmaceutical bottles that you posted were of Park Davis bottles. And I know during 1910 and early 1920s, Park Davis and the pharmaceutical companies were going through significant changes in their processes. I'm wondering if you saw any, or if your book or any other work that you've done goes into how these drugs, how the extracts were made, and if any lessons from other botanical extracts were maybe applied to the cannabis extracts.
Am I dead? Did I freeze? What's going on?
There you go.
We can hear you, Chris.
We can hear you.
Your video seems to have gone away, but we can hear you.
Yeah, I don't know where he went.
We're having technical difficulties, as they
I
say.
think so.
In the old days, there was a pause that came up on the television. So we were experiencing technical difficulties. So
Okay.
he's gone away very briefly, hopefully.
I'm hoping he'll be able to speak to how these extracts were made, with concerns of, quality, strength, efficacy. And so I'm curious. I know there's a shift in how these extracts were made based on what I learned looking at how extract was made.
Okay. Did I freeze up? You guys all disappeared for me for a second.
Hey, you're there. I see you.
Okay, I'm here. Okay, I'm good. I'm good again. All right. So from what I heard of your question, I'm not an expert on that. Like, that's not what I did a lot of work on. But
Okay.
if you look at historical pharmaceutical journals, there was a lot of effort to try to figure out how to do something reliable with this plant material. But at the same time, you read it, and they clearly had no idea what they were looking for. In many cases, they bought green material because they liked the color it would give to what they made. So there's stories of them buying green stems rather than like flowers or anything that has, significant amounts of THC in it. There was also a lot of concern about testing, and from 1895 to about 1910, there was a lot of efforts on figuring out how to do animal tests, and there's just amusing but horrifying stories of how they would inject just massive amounts into dogs and figure out what was going on. And there was these articles about like, how do you determine which dog is best to inject and things like that. So they were really working at it, but the underlying problem is they didn't know anything about cannabinoid chemistry, right? And that really was an unknown until the 1960s. And so they could have tried and tried and tried. They might have hit on something, but they didn't have the knowledge to reliably do anything at that point in time. But there was a lot of effort into it. They were just unsuccessful, is my understanding.
Interesting. And maybe you and I can talk about that more at a different time together.
And I'll just make a quick comment that Adam Rathke, who I mentioned, he's on this and he'll talk later. That's partly what his research is on, is the problems with the medicine. And I'm sorry if I'm misrepresenting you, Adam, but like the problems with pharmacy practice was a big motivation for early laws to control cannabis. So that's all I'll say. Listen to his talk.
Okay. Okay, so can you say something about gender, perhaps, about how cannabis is used?
Yeah, and so a couple of things. One is that the European record is highly biased because it was mostly written by male explorers watching over their male porters. And so we know very well what, 20 to 30-year-old male Africans did with cannabis, right? And we have a lot less information about other groups of people, right? Europeans weren't invited to go to religious ceremonies for the most part. They weren't, European travelers were mostly men, and they weren't invited to go, spend time with women doing just the regular things that the women were doing. So there were certainly gender differences. We don't know what they were. Photographs and kind of descriptions from the early 20th century show that women were certainly consuming, but we don't know a whole lot about differences in consumption. In some cases, we do know that women were responsible for preparing the pharmaceuticals, the stuff that people would smoke, but again, we don't have a lot of information on that.
Interesting. Thank you. So I'm going to combine a couple questions here. So there's a few questions about how do you interpret the shift in European interest towards cannabis after the end of slavery? Is it safe to assume that it had to do with the emergence of gardener botanists and their travels? Or does the end of slavery account for this? And I'm going to add in there, is there a class component to this at all in this shift of thinking?
Yeah, so class, so a couple of different things. Thinking first about class. Within African societies, people used it from high positions to low positions. And so there's a lot of accounts in Western Central Africa of European travelers being hosted by, chiefs or chieftains or whatever the term that they would use, and the chiefs or chieftains using cannabis during their meetings. And it was distracting for a lot of the Europeans, but there were a number of Europeans that partook and were engaged with that because it was instrumental to them. So there was some, the class aspect I don't talk about. I didn't talk about much today, but it was there. The reason I think for the shift in attitudes was a couple of things. The most important thing I think was that there was a lot more emphasis during the formal colonial period of extracting value from resources, not just extracting people. And so there's a lot of history, a lot of documentation of hard laborers in mining using cannabis. In transport, I talked about porters, but also later truck drivers and train operators, train staff. The Europeans became more concerned of labor quality rather than just quantity, which was the case in the period of formal slavery. And so there was that concern just about the quality of labor, and they blamed low quality on cannabis. Part of the reason they did that is that in the 1890s and 1840s, but particularly in the 1890s, there was in Western Central Africa a sleeping sickness epidemic that brought down labor quantity as well as quality, and a discourse developed that cannabis caused sleeping sickness, right? And sleeping sickness is trypanosomiasis. It's a microbe infection that's transmitted by tsetse flies. But this discourse came about that cannabis causes illness, right? Not the working conditions, not the poor food or poor sanitation. And so it was easy for people, colonialists, to start blaming cannabis for the problems that the colonial governments effectively produced. So I think those are the two different things. One was the concern about labor quality, and the second, different discourses about the health impacts of cannabis. Well, and then one other thing, right? I was thinking just about Central Africa. In South Africa, there was a discourse about violence and cannabis consumption. It also existed in Egypt, and those two countries were important for kind of bringing cannabis to the Geneva Convention.
I'm going to interject very quickly. I just want to thank Professor Tembisa Whitegin and also Lina Brito for asking those questions. And I wanted to say, too, we have a comment from Pullman Nkosi, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, saying, I'm very honored to be part of this conference and virtually meeting Professor Duvall. My question is based on different effects of cannabis observed by European travelers during their presence in Africa. Based on their accounts, some said that some of the effects of cannabis on African slaves was that it made them lazier and tired, whereas others observed that it was a stimulant. So there's that question. There's also a question from Dr. Richard Del Rio. He's a friend of the Institute, having won an award from AIHP in the past, and also congratulations on just getting a postdoc at the University of Florida, Richard. Your question is, could Professor Duvall please talk about the sources consulted to put together these charts of international wholesale transaction? And do you mind expanding on some of the quantities involved in these transactions? So those are a couple of, I think, good questions.
Sure, let me write those. Okay, so the first couple of questions had to do with the effects of cannabis plus attitudes towards it. Cannabis is really interesting because the effects, the subjective effects, are highly context dependent. This is the case with all substances, but for cannabis it's particularly powerful. And so in many cases, if a person thinks that cannabis will have a particular outcome, that thinking along with the pharmacology will help produce that outcome. And so within the African context that I'm talking about, again, mostly looking at laborers because that's where the source literature is, these guys thought of it as a stimulant that would get them going, right? It was something that partly produced that effect, right? That was just the context it was used in. Other contexts, in South Africa, there were some religious uses that are effectively not documented. We know that they exist. It had a very different set of impacts in those contexts. And so partly what people, when outsiders were observing it, they were observing the context as much as anything. And so if people were using it in a context that made them think, oh, this is going to just make me sit and have a conversation, that's what would happen, and that's what the outsiders would see. Now, it's important also, thinking about attitudes towards labor. There was always in exploitative labor relationships, whether it's formal slavery, 400 years ago, or current slavery now, people, the overseers see the workers a lot of times as being lazy and worthless, right? And a large part of that is because the workers have no motivation to be anything other than do the minimum, right? And so when we see accounts historically in Africa of Henry Morton Stanley, right, of saying that cannabis is terrible because it makes my porters lazy, he was judgmental about everyone, and particularly about Africans and African laborers. He thought that they were not ever doing enough work. He neglected, giving them water. They had to supply their own water. They had to supply their own food in many cases. And so these were people who were malnourished. They were exposed. They were, constantly dehydrated. There's a reason they weren't highly efficient workers, right? And, kind of the laziness can also be kind of seen as being resistance to colonial control. And so we see that as well. And cannabis served in that respect to resist colonial control. There's a lot of accounts of, basically workers going and finding some secluded spot to smoke and, basically through their actions telling their boss to get lost, right? And this is resistance to colonialism, and cannabis as well as other substances helped perpetuate that. So it's really difficult looking at the expressed attitudes because you have this political economic context, but you also have this matter of subjective effects that makes it really challenging a lot of times to understand specifically what was going on. Now, with regard to the global pharmaceutical markets, the data are mostly from that journal Chemist and Druggist, and then there was an American one, the name of which is not coming to me right now, maybe the American Pharmaceutical Journal or something like that. They had market reports from the 1860s until the 1920s where they would describe the provenance. In many cases, they would describe the quality, and then they would describe the price per unit. And I presented that graph in pounds per gram, I think is what it was. But it was really difficult kind of normalizing both the price and the quantity because a lot of the prices were given in, obscure currencies. So you have to go and find, currency conversion manuals from the late 1800s and figure out what a Guineas dollar was worth in pounds. You have to figure out what weight measurements in Angola were used and how those compared with the pounds. And there's historical documents on all of this, so you can find that. But again, the pharmaceutical literature has, the trade journals at that point in time have really thorough market reports. There are a couple of other sources of pricing data, either, travelers' accounts of how much people were paying for cannabis that you can kind of convert into prices. There were state mandated prices in some markets, Tunisia and Morocco, for instance. And so there's a whole variety of sources there. But again, the Chemist and Druggist Journal is the most thorough one. and it focuses just on the London market. And I'm happy to share sources. If you want to send me an email, I can reach you to word stuff.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so we have a lot of really good questions. I did want to backtrack just a little bit to the beginning of that group when we were talking about how cannabis was used as a stimulant prior to labor and a relaxant after. Did you find any anecdotes or any evidence of if this was used as like a pain reliever or for any sort of pain to manage the aches and pains of such hard labor?
Very limited. Again, for the most part, the Europeans just described that these people are smoking this thing. But they do in some cases say, here's why they're doing it. And again, it was mostly just a stimulant. There are some accounts of pain for specific sort of pain complaints. So lung pain, right? Chest pain is one that was reported from South Africa. Again, I think that was in Eastern Natal is where that was from. There's an account also from Sierra Leone, and that's justified to some extent, right? Cannabis does, if smoked, does help or can help treat some lung complaints. There was a lot of uses of it medicinally in veterinary medicine in some locations. There was a lot of external use of it medicinally. There was, bong water, like the water that's in the water pipe. People use that medicinally as well. But the literature, again, is not very good because the Europeans who wrote the literature just really didn't care.
Let me leave it there. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually have some questions about technology, which is really interesting. Could you give a brief rundown of the diffusion of African smoking technology, especially water pipes, to Asia? Mm-hmm. What archaeological or other evidence exists, and what kind of complications make it difficult to trace this technological diffusion? I can only say that so many times. As well as what is the earliest evidence that you have of water pipes?
Okay, so a lot of stuff there. So there's a really good archaeological record of pipe bowls, right? Most of the pipes that are known historically in Africa were made out of some biodegradable main body component that held the water, and the bowls themselves were made out of either stone or clay, and so those persisted. The earliest that the archaeological evidence that's coming to mind is about 2,000 years ago from Central Africa, about 1,500 years ago, I think, from Eastern Africa. The earliest evidence of cannabis smoked in a pipe is from Ethiopia, and that's dated to the early 1300s. But most pipes haven't been tested for residue, and most of them don't have any residue. There was earlier use of cannabis smoke as an intoxicant in southern and central Asia. There was, last week a report of residue being found in a temple, an ancient Israeli temple. But these were really inefficient ways of doing it. I mean, burn enough to fill a room with smoke and get high from that is basically what people were doing. And that's really an inefficient way to use the material. And so the African pipes allowed people to use a very small amount of material and precisely control how much, right? Self-titration is what they were able to do. In terms of the diffusion, the biggest problem is that this happened sometime in the period between about 1300 to 1500 or 1600, right before the diffusion of tobacco in the Mediterranean basin in South Asia. And so we have these accounts that are kind of puzzling from Yemen and Arabia that sounds like maybe people were smoking things. But what we don't have is bowls anywhere else. We don't have pipe bowls anywhere else. And looking at the terms for plants, what appears to have happened is that the use of the coconut as a container for water pipes originated somewhere, the Comoros Islands, Madagascar, and East African coast facing there. At some point, that knowledge was taken into pre-existing knowledge of smoking because you have different terms for pipe and for coconut. But in South Asia, so the Persian or Arabian Gulf, you have the name for the pipe and the coconut as being the same thing. So it appears that they may have arrived together. From there, people kind of developed more complicated versions of water pipes. The hookah, they're not more complicated, that's the wrong word. They're just different containers, right? So they used glass containers and clay containers that weren't used in Africa. From there, they seem to have traveled through South Asia. And in the Western world, other than the hookah or the shisha that people recognized from the Mediterranean basin, the actual, basic fundamental African water pipe was, as far as I can tell, not really known or used until American soldiers brought it back from Southeast Asia, Vietnam, in the 1970s. But there hasn't been, as far as I know, also a study of pipes in Europe and North America associated specifically with cannabis. We do have the African pipe showing up in Brazil and Jamaica, but it didn't travel as well across the Atlantic because everywhere cannabis ended up, people already knew how to smoke things, but they used dry pipes, the American dry pipes. And so you don't see the water pipe showing up as widely because people didn't need the new technology. They just put the cannabis in the pipes they already had. That's a long answer. I'm not sure I got to all the parts, though.
Yeah, before Naomi asks you a couple more questions, I just wanted to read out a couple of comments from people. I think it's important that they have their voices heard if they're chiming in. Romeo Alonso suggests that he's privileged to be a part of this and is you for the presentation. I'll say that we're glad to have you here as well, Romeo Alonso. Thank you for that. Kirsten Frame, thanks you, Dr. Duvall, for sharing all your knowledge and found the presentation to be interesting and useful, and she wishes us all a blessed day. So I just wanted to read those comments out. Naomi, back to you, please.
Okay. So we're going to bring this a little bit more to the modern era, a little bit closer. And somebody asked, do the traditional uses of cannabis by Africans to endure hard labor and hardship convey in any way modern uses of cannabis by disenfranchised populations?
Okay. Well, first off, let me just say, since Luke read those comments, that it's awkward and new for all of us professors to give talks like this, I think. But it's really cool that we can connect with people, around the world. And in my teaching this past semester, it was interesting to be able to interact with people very widely. So I'm glad that everyone's able to join. All right, so traditional uses and modern uses. I make a real clear point in the book, and I'll make it now, is that I stopped studying this until about 1930, right? I went up until about 1930, simply because there was a number of changes that happened at that point in time. The Geneva Convention that brought cannabis under international control is the main one. So I don't study the current context, right? I'm aware of it. There's a lot of very strong parallels. There's structural racism that impacts both drug use and policing of drug use. But I'm not saying that there's a connection between his African history, a direct connection at least between his African history and the current context, right? What I would say, though, is there's this line of thinking called sociopharmacology that basically looks at the social, economic, and political context of drug consumption in order to understand these contextual factors that cause people to consume substances. And for cannabis in particular, but also for some other substances, this is a substance that has been used for, going back, to at least the 1200s is the first work that I can think of right now from South Asia, associating it with hard labor, right? And so it's this substance that is somehow, for some reason, helpful for people who are enduring difficulties, right? And that can be physical difficulties. It can be certain types of mental anguish and difficulties as well. And so the structures within societies that produce this marginalization, this exploitation of laborers and other people, that produces the context in which marijuana, cannabis has thrived, right? You know, and it's important not to lose sight of that. You know, here in the United States, at least, cannabis is increasingly mainstream. It's increasingly portrayed as something that everyone does, which is, you know, it's certainly entering into new circles that it hadn't entered into before, decriminalization and legalization in some locations. But it's really important to recognize that the studies that we have within the United States, at least, is that there is an association between cannabis use and lower educational attainment and lower income. And that's not to say that one causes the other. It's to say, and it's not to generalize about any group of people, whether it's cannabis users or you know, people with, you know, certain educational levels. It's just to say that we have this connection, right? In that book by David Courtwright, the Force of Habit, the important part of that book is to say that, you know, this expansion of use is really associated with an expansion of kind of capital modes of governance and economics. So a long answer there, right? But it's important to say, you know, slaves did not bring cannabis to America, to the United States. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. And the relationships that I document for the past, I'm not saying that they are directly what led to the conditions that are very much analogous now, but we do have to think about how social context produces, you know, drug use.
Thank you. And I do have to add that running questions online versus running questions in person is definitely different. There's, you know, we can't continue these conversations organically after, but I'm hoping that participants reach out to you to continue these conversations, but I have a bunch more to get to you. Yeah. So we have a couple questions about actually your resources that you used. Someone asked about the sources that you consulted to put together the chart of international wholesale transactions, the slide connecting Calcutta to Guyana. Can you expand on the quantities? And then to follow up, did you have to travel to these archives, or were these sources that you could access digitally?
Yeah, and these are, I could have done this all, not all of it, but most of it I could have done from sitting right here, but it was a pre-coronavirus sort of isolation, I guess. No, and that's, you know, that's an important thing to say, is that this was not based on digging around through archives. It's based on using the digital resources that have exploded in the last 10 years. And those are incredibly useful archives for historians and other people. And it's really important not to underestimate what exists in the published record that's just been forgotten. And that's especially true with cannabis. Like the books that are portrayed as world histories or histories of this continent or whatever, you know, there's literally like a small handful of books that are reliable for cannabis history. So many of them are just not very good. I won't say anything more than that. And so if you're interested in cannabis history, and I see there's folks writing in from India, like there is not a good history of cannabis in India right now. There's an 1893 document that remains like one of the best in existence for anywhere. So, you know, the wholesale market, you know, again, that's something I just kind of touch on. There needs to be a study of the records that are available in India about wholesale practices and just general market structure. Again, the 1893 Indian Hemp Commission report is great. But most of the rest of that is from accounts of people in other parts of the world saying, oh, the laborers in Guyana are buying good ganja from India, why can't we in London get that good ganja? And it's because the people in India who were selling it knew who would pay good prices. And you can find a lot of information about the pricing. The taxation question in India is a huge one. Basically, Bengal was where the good material was coming from, but they also had really high tax levels for various reasons. And overall, the British Indian government wanted to control prices so that there wouldn't be smuggling between states. And that, again, that rippled and impacted the entire global market. But, I present that it's not a focus of mine. It's something I felt I had to learn about in order to understand the markets in Angola and Mozambique. But like so many things in cannabis history, like it just really hasn't been studied substantially. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm missing stuff. So if anyone knows, please chime in. But yeah, there's a lot of economic data that's out there that hasn't been assessed. So much of it is available online. If you spend some time on Google Books or Hathi Trust, or Per Se is a French one, there's a lot of primary sources that are published. They're sitting in some library somewhere, but they just really haven't been meaningfully looked at. The colonial governments in the Americas and Africa also kept records for tax purposes, and so Guyana, the colonial government of Guyana, they're the ones that kept records of imports and exports to Suriname, Dutch Guyana, and to the West Indies. And so, British Guyana was this hub of what we would call trafficking right now, but at that point in time, it was pharmaceutical marketing. That again hasn't been looked at substantially. I've looked at it briefly, but if you're interested in that, please go do that research. There's a lot out there.
Chris, can I put one final question to you as we're kind of running out of time here?
Yeah, please.
So from Dr. Rathji, who says, thanks for shouting out his talk. He appreciates it. He was struck by your map of prohibitions across Africa prior to 1925 because it looked a lot like a map of the U.S. in the same period. And just thought maybe you could expand on that. Yeah,
and he's the expert for the American laws, but one thing I always bring up is the county I'm in right now, Bernalillo County in New Mexico. They had one of the earliest laws, and it was a pretty strict prohibition. I think it was 1915, maybe 1913, and you had a lot of these kind of local level decision making here in the United States, where you had cities and counties banning things for different reasons. Here in Bernalillo County, they thought it was because it made the U.S. soldiers who were stationed here lazy and worthless. In Africa, there was a whole number of reasons. The different countries banned cannabis at different times. In most cases, it was a pretty hard prohibition. There was only a couple places where it was just kind of to control pharmaceutical practice, which was important in the United States. So 2 examples in Madagascar, the earliest prohibition was by the Marina royalty. I mean, these were not Europeans. It was the Malagasy royal house. They wanted to modernize their country, and so they banned alcohol and cannabis. It was part of their modernization effort. In Sudan, for another example, the British government in Sudan didn't seem to really care about it, but the Anglo-Egyptian government did, and so British Sudan, banned cannabis in order to for these kind of intercolonial diplomatic relationships that were there. So there's a lot of different local reasons that each of the colonies had different kind of reasoning, but the overall impact was essentially an absolute prohibition, not just like a control or anything like that. It was, if it's done in that colony. But it's a good comparison.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we have reached the time limit. I wanted to thank you, Chris, one last time for this. It was truly informative. I'd like to thank Naomi for acting as the moderator, not an easy task by any stretch of the imagination. I'd like to thank everyone out there as well. By my rough count, it looks like we had 17, maybe 18 different countries here today, and which is pretty cool. Next week, we're turning to the United States, where we have Dr. Emily Dustin discuss her book, which came out in 2017. And I encourage you all to register for that one, and also to check out the pages of the Social History of Alcohol and Drugs, which has a new issue coming out dealing with Latin America, Mexico in particular, and drugs, as well as pharmacy and history, and its issue is forthcoming. Also, very last plug, if you like these sorts of things, please be involved with the American Institute for the History of Pharmacy. I've been around the Institute for a year and a half now. I'm looking forward to help lead more of these webinars and more programming. Looking forward to as much input from members, new and old alike. So please get involved if you're a student or even if you're not a student. So thanks again. And I guess I'll see you all next week. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.